The Total War Pharaoh Dynasties expansion releases today, June 25th. So to celebrate the last hurrah of our favorite Bronze Age simulator, I want to take you all on a tour of the greatest highlights of the Near East. We will see some pretty bits, but also get a better sense of the world of the Bronze Age collapse. No matter how ancient and distant the events of Pharaoh may seem to us now, these people lived among the ruins and beneath the shadows of monuments often far older than even their own eras. Chogha Zanbil. Constructed around 1250 BCE, only a generation before game start, this is the youngest and easternmost of the great ziggurats. Dedicated to the Elamite patron god of Susa in Shushanak, this was an absolutely massive religious center with worship sites dedicated to the full pantheon of Elamite gods, including both local gods and many imported from Mesopotamia. Having been built during one of the high watermarks of Elamite culture, it would continue to be patronized during the peaks of their wealth and political power until being destroyed during the Assyrian conquest around 645. Though we usually call it Chogha Zanbil today, meaning basket mound in reference to its general shape, it would have been called Dur Untash in the period of the game, meaning the town of the king Untash Naprisha, who constructed the monument and its supporting structures. In-game, it gives the holder legitimacy and adds to Susa's holdout time, possibly a reference to the dramatic and difficult campaigns of Nebuchadnezzar I against Susa around 1110 BCE. Etemenanki. Meaning temple of the foundation of heaven and earth, it's disputed when exactly the great Babylonian ziggurat was actually constructed. Possibly sometime during the Kassite period, though some do hold to a later date even than Pharaoh Total War. This would have been a shiny and new construction during the period of the game, a veritable man-made mountain of mud brick and hubris. Ancient sources claim that it was 91 meters tall and nearly solid, a description that baffles modern scholars who believe that the very weight of such a structure would crush the mud brick of the lower foundation and topple the building. Dedicated to the Babylonian patron god Marduk and often declared to be something generally like the center of the spiritual world and a connection between the heavens and the earth, it should not be confused with the legends of the Tower of Babel. Though surely it was being referenced in the biblical book of Genesis for various political and cultic reasons, we do have ancient texts outlining the same story of the tower upon which all human languages were one and currently are no longer, written long before the city of Babylon was even founded. Check out my main show, the Oldest Stories podcast, for more on why that legendary original tower may have been in Eridu. The in-game bonus here is some legitimacy plus a modest movement bonus within the province, so not really a must-have beyond the benefits of holding Babylon itself. White Temple of An. Though unusual for a ziggurat, the base the temple is standing on is in fact an artificial mountain of mud brick. It's far flatter and broader than most ziggurats, but the land around Uruk is so flat that a structure rising only 40 feet into the sky would still have been visible enough to see on the horizon on a clear day. All ziggurats were topped with a temple, since the point was just to raise that temple itself high enough to interact with the gods who lived in the sky, and ironically the sky god An got one of the shortest ziggurats and one of the larger temples. An was an interesting god, sometimes the oldest of the gods, but always among the oldest. During recorded history, he seems to have had the role of retired former king, as other gods passed the mantle of kingship amongst themselves. While it's speculated that he had been full king in the prehistoric, pre-literate millennia of Sumerian civilization before records were kept, but still while massive cities and temples and colonies were being founded, we ultimately have no good way to know for sure. This particular temple dates to that pre-literate period, sometime in the unrecorded 4th millennium BCE, so it predates writing itself. The in-game effect is a legitimacy boost and half-off construction costs in the province, which does give Uruk a nice leg up in development. Ziggurat of Enlil. Built at the tail end of the early Bronze Age, during the last flourishing gasp of Sumerian civilization, this ziggurat was constructed explicitly in order to try and recapture the glories of what were, to the people of 2000 BCE, already a long-faded era, many centuries past. Enlil was, by this point, the king of the gods, and his holy city, Nippur, was a unique town in the Sumerian period. As far as we can tell, though warfare was endemic among the cities of Sumer, it might be the case that no one ever fought a war within the walls of Nippur during this Sumerian period. It was a holy site dedicated to the idea of kingship and to the king of the gods, but the city itself was never crowned king of the cities in the early dynastic period, a title which itself was passed around the other major cities of the south. By the Bronze Age collapse, this structure built in emulation of things long past is now itself long past. 800 years have gone by and have not been kind to any of the once rich cities of Sumer. The spiritual mantle of Nippur has long since been usurped by Babylon, but the great kings of Mesopotamia continue to remember and patronize the decaying temples in the mostly abandoned towns out of respect for what is, for them, now a thing of the deep and revered past. In-game, it gives you legitimacy and a boost to newly recruited generals, which seems a bit arbitrary. Ziggurat of Ur. Etemeninguru, the temple whose foundation creates an aura, was built by the first king of the last Sumerian dynasty and restored by the last king of the last Babylonian dynasty, making it at least a bit cursed. Dedicated to the moon god Nana. Though Nana was a divine personage, he was also literally the moon itself, and believed to visit the inside of the temple, though how they expected the moon itself to come down from the sky for a visit is a logistical question lost to the ages. Originally, it may have been a full 100 feet in height, possibly, but even in the modern era, it remains the best preserved of the ancient ziggurats, though the very nice base that you see nowadays in modern reconstruction was sponsored by Saddam Hussein back in the 1980s, which marks another dynasty ender who put some restoration work into a ziggurat that had crumbled to ruins. Maybe it really is cursed. In-game, it gives you a bit of legitimacy and some gold income, but is that really worth it compared to the weight of the curse? Nimrod. On the topic of Kalhu, I find myself disappointed on multiple levels. First of all, in a game that does such a good job, it prides itself on using endonyms for its cities, using the actual names in the original languages for the cities as much as possible. The fact that this town is named Nimrod, a moniker given to it by early modern archaeologists who thought it might be the site of the Tower of Babel, is a pretty big miss. The town was named Kalhu in Akkadian, and it's also known as Kala in other Semitic languages such as Biblical Hebrew, which is pretty close, but more to the point, this town should barely even be in there. There's not actually any evidence for a Kalhu prior to 879 BCE. Ashur-nasirpal, the king who builds this city in the Iron Age, claims that Shalmaneser I had founded the town originally in the 1250s or so, but Shalmaneser himself never mentions it, nor does anyone else until Ashur-nasirpal's time. So at best, what was founded was a small work or agricultural community at the end of a canal. At worst, Ashurnasirpal was either just mistaken or was claiming that his grand capital city had a greater origin story than it actually did to increase his own sense of importance. He was a very self-important fellow. And also, the town should not be on the Tigris River. It was off a canal on the upper Zab River. For a game that really gets so much right, Nimrod is a big swing and a miss. Check out my Call of Kalhu episode for a lot more depth on the founding of what is actually a fascinating city. Gameplay-wise, it's just another minor settlement, not much going on here for or against it. Hittite Rock Sanctuary. At least as old as the Hittite Empire, this shrine outside the Hittite capital city was extensively reworked in the century leading up to the Bronze Age collapse. Today, it's a place where some cool inscriptions can be found in a very natural setting, but back in its heyday, it would have been home to literally hundreds of divine idols. The Hittite heartland was called the Land of 1,000 Gods because the Hittites had a habit of stealing gods from the peoples they conquered. And while not all of these captured idols would have physically ended up in this rock sanctuary, many would have, becoming part pantheon and part museum of the many cultures of the late Bronze Age. Only the parts literally carved into the rocks have survived the collapse of Hattusha, but the fact that this place exists at all is fascinating. In-game, it provides a bonus to legitimacy and troop replenishment in the region, so whatever. Kumani and Kanesh. I don't actually know why there's a cool waterfall here. Perhaps this is meant as the famous Silver Mountain, which is possibly Mount Ursius that Sargon of Akkad once marked as the western edge of his world's first empire. But this region in general is a significant but underappreciated one. Kanesh was home to the greatest of the Assyrian trade outposts back in the Middle Bronze Age, which is significant because before Assyria was any sort of military empire, it enjoyed a few centuries of flourishing as perhaps the world's first great trade empire, with joint stock companies and colonial enterprises scattered throughout the Near East. And as Kanesh was falling, the dynasty that would become the Hittite Empire was arising out of the same city, only to conquer Hattusha and make that its capital a century or so later. Kumani, meanwhile, was home to some of the most spiritual centers of the Hittite Empire, a region of sacred groves and mountains where temples dotted the landscape. No real in-game effects here, but it does look quite nice. Sphinx Gate of Arinna. So Creative Assembly has taken the position that the archaeological site northwest of Hattusha, nowadays called Alkahoyuk, was the town of Arinna. This isn't a bad guess, but there is still uncertainty on the matter. Assuming they are correct here, though, Arinna was a major shrine to the Hittite sun goddess. Interestingly, we'll probably never know what her name actually was, since it was always written out using the Sumerian characters for sun god, which, like modern Chinese, were ideographs not necessarily tied to the particular sound when those characters move from language to language. Consider equivalent Chinese characters in Mandarin, Cantonese, and Japanese to see what I mean, and you can see that since the name was never actually spelled out phonetically, we'll never know how it was pronounced. This sun goddess of forgotten name hosted a major cult at this site whose shrine has survived in part to modern times, and whether or not barbarians were attacking this northern but not so distant city is often used by Hittite annals as a proxy for how good or bad the empire was doing in its chaotic up and down history. In-game, holding this gives political legitimacy and divine favor, which makes sense for such a major shrine. Mount Lebanon. The great snowy peaks of Mount Lebanon give the whole region its name, Lebanon being connected etymologically to the Semitic word for white. I'm quite glad that they included the mighty mountain here, as it was the goal for many conquering Mesopotamians, all the way from semi-mythical Gilgamesh to Sargon of Akkad to the Assyrian conquerors of the Iron Age. Covered in the famous Lebanese cedar trees, this was the best wood in this entire part of the world, prized for its size, straightness, usefulness as a building material, and also the fantastic smell of the cut wood. The mountain itself was the only snow that you would see year-round down in Canaan, and would have been a notable sight for visitors in the decidedly unsnowy Egypt and Mesopotamia. I have no idea why it's been rendered as this mystic tropical waterfall thing with no snow that looks like it really belongs in Total War Warhammer, but it does look cool, and it's great that they did something for this site. No direct gameplay effects here, but look at that great choke point for Byblos that's created there. Makes that Byblos Kadesh pathway super strategic, which of course it was historically. Palace at Knossos. Before the Mycenaeans, the Minoans were the dominant civilization of the West. Based in Crete, the ruins of their once mighty capital of Knossos still stood during the days of the ancient Greeks and likely influenced many of the great myths, such as the Minotaur and Icarus. Though some of the palaces are still around today, we can't even decipher all the Minoan writing, and little enough survives that they leave us with a lot of mysteries. Some people even questioning such basic ideas as whether or not they had kings and wars. By the late Bronze Age, they are in steep decline, almost totally overshadowed by the mainland Greeks, and it's far from clear what their neighbors in the Aegean thought of them, though certainly interesting to speculate. Gameplay-wise, it looks like there's an outpost slot here, but no actual structure at game start. I can't start as them and don't really have time to conquer the area just to figure it out for this video, so I'm gonna leave it as a mystery for the viewer. Go conquer it, see if you can build anything in there, leave a note down in the comments. Lemnos necropolis. The necropolis of Hephaestia actually post-dates the game, with most putting the dates when it was in active use to the early Iron Age, but Lemnos in general has been the site of some fascinating and extensive archaeology. Like many Greek islands, it was inhabited continuously for some 10,000 years or more, and by the time civilization arose, these islanders were called Pelasgians. On Lemnos in particular, there's much speculation about a connection between the Lemnian Pelasgians and the Etruscans of northern Italy, as well as connections between the islanders and the Mycenaeans. But for all that they have their own interesting stories in their own right, there's little here which actually intersects the outside world in a practical sense, and there shouldn't actually be a necropolis here for a few more centuries. That fire on the mountaintop, though, would have been basically an early lighthouse, a necessity for trade and travel in the ancient Aegean. In-game, the necropolis boosts your legitimacy and line of sight in the region, though again I imagine that's more in reference to the lighthouse than the necropolis itself. Mount Olympus. Home of the Greek gods, it's said that no one in the ancient world ever tried climbing to the top, though who knows if that's really true. As far as mountains go, it's nice and is certainly the biggest in the area, but its mythological associations likely don't come from the mountain itself, but may have been imported from the east during the late Bronze Age and during the Collapse era. More and more connections are being made between the religions of the Anatolian peoples, Luwians, Hittites, Hurrians, and so forth, with those of the Greeks. The Anatolians were, in turn, influenced by the Canaanite and Mesopotamian religions, which held that the proper abode for gods was atop high mountains. See my own episodes on the Baal cycle for an example of that. And during the formative years of the Bronze Age collapse, where the Mycenaeans were transformed into archaic Greeks, those imported Eastern legends seem to have gotten a firm foothold in Europe atop this high mountain. There are no gameplay effects, but it sure does look nice. Statue of Cybele. In the classical period, Ephesus would be famous for its Temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the world. Long before Artemis was venerated by the Greeks, however, the same area played host to the worship of the mother goddess Cybele, and at Mount Pion, near the ancient city, archaeologists have found a significant worship and burial site with the mother goddess statues carved into the rock. Cybele is a great example of syncretism among the ancient deities. We don't know where exactly she originated, but she seems to have been popular all throughout Anatolia even before the Hittite period. Her worship extends down south into Canaan, and from the Canaanite cities makes its way into the Phoenician colonies such as Carthage, and at the same time the heavy influence of Anatolian faith and myth on the Greeks sees Cybele brought into their worship, and ultimately Cybele becomes the great mother goddess of the ancient Romans, a people who seem to have known almost nothing about the pre-Hittite Anatolian cultures who had birthed their city's divine mother. Akhenaten. Constructed around 1350 BCE, only 150 years old, this is one of the newer sites on the map and one of the more archaeologically important. Akhenaten, nowadays called Amarna, was built by Pharaoh Akhenaten as part of his total reform for Egypt centered around the sun god Aten. None of his reforms survived his death, and the city itself was abandoned after only a few decades, but its status as former capital meant that quite a lot of important documents were left behind to be buried in the sands, which have been uncovered in the modern era as the famous Amarna letters, from which we learned so much about the political situation of the late Bronze Age. In-game, it starts as just another ruined city, its glory days long past, and doesn't have any particular graphics, just a cool backstory. Napata Petrified Forest. Egypt is home to a very famous petrified forest called Gebal Akashab near Cairo. Some 30 million years ago, much more of northern Africa was forested, and the ancient Nile River seems to have picked up a ton of trees from upriver, only for them to get caught in mud and buried at certain points along the way. The ancient soil buried the wood as well as other plants and animals in quite sealed conditions, allowing for just the right conditions for petrification and fossilization. As the region turned to desert and the Nile shifted course, wind erosion gradually uncovered these ancient treasures, and it's one of the nicer things to see around Cairo, after the pyramids, of course. That said, this deposit is way down in Upper Egypt, around the new minor faction of Napata. I genuinely have no idea if there is a huge deposit out here. I can't find anything solid to base this off of. Or if they're just illustrating that, yeah, there are petrified wood deposits along the ancient courses of the Nile, and they picked this relatively empty place to illustrate that. No gameplay effect, but it is neat to remember that Egypt wasn't always a desert, and the Nile once flowed through forest land. Finally, Egypt is absolutely chock full of wonders, and given the Egypt focus of the based game, I assume many are already familiar with a lot of them, so we're gonna lightning round these for the sake of completeness. Colossi of Memnon, built around 1350 for the mortuary temple of Amenhotep III. Valley of the Kings, a bunch of tombs built between the 18th and 20th dynasties, housing some of the most famous Egyptian kings and their families. Temple of Ipet-Reset, Luxor Temple in English, built around 1400 and became the place where many Egyptian kings were either crowned or claimed to have been crowned. Great Temple of Abydos, built by Seti I, founder of the dynasty which is basically ending with Merneptah. This was quite a nice temple. Ipet-Set Temple Complex, usually called the Temple of Karnak. This is a massive temple complex which was started around 2000 BCE and continuously expanded until the Ptolemaic dynasty around 100 BCE. So almost 2,000 years of more or less active use. Djeser is a super cool structure dug into a cliff housing the body of Hatshepsut, a female pharaoh of the 1450s, and quite an interesting historical figure in her own right. Ramesseum. Built by Merneptah's father Ramesses the Great, this is only one of his many over-the-top constructions, but was probably one of the coolest. Very little survives today, though, as most of it was torn down for other construction materials. The Bent Pyramid. This was the second pyramid ever built, around 2600 BCE, and they realized halfway as they built it that it was too steep, so they had to make it all wonky at the top to prevent collapse. Step Pyramid of Djoser, the first pyramid in history, built by the first king of the Third Dynasty. Step pyramids are way easier to build than smooth ones, and being the first, it didn't have much to compete with. Red Pyramid. This was Sneferu's third pyramid after the Bent Pyramid proved to be an embarrassment. This was the first time they got the whole straight sides thing right. Great Pyramids of Giza. Built by Khufu in the Third Dynasty, this is the big one, the one everyone wants to see, and the tallest man-made structure from about 2570 BCE until the Lincoln Cathedral in London was completed in 1311 CE. All in all, the game effects of wonders in general are pretty modest, which I'm actually quite a fan of. The truth is that basically none of these were constructed for practical purposes. Instead, they were mostly celebrated for the glory of the kings and the gods who controlled them. But the historical lessons are awe-inspiring and remind us of what ancient men were able to accomplish with little more than mud, stone, and dedication. But on that note, let me leave you with a thought. It's often said that we couldn't build structures quite like these ancient monuments anymore in the modern era, and there is a sense to which that's true. These were built with countless man-hours of effort, made possible because the value of labor, the worth of a man's life and his time, was, in the ancient world, extremely minimal. The scope of what a single man could accomplish was extremely limited, and therefore a man's efforts could be purchased at very low cost. And most of these were constructed by free men, either working as part of their tax burden or as hired laborers. There were slaves involved often as well, but not to the extent that the movies might make you think. But the very conditions that enabled the construction of these monuments, the stability of the civilization and the wealth of the ruler, is also what, over the long centuries, has made them impossible to replicate, as that same wealth and stability lifted the tide of even the lower classes to the point where it became too expensive to build more grand monuments at the same scale. Ramesses the Great built no pyramids because even by his era, just a grand funerary temple was already enough to strain the budget. The value of labor was still low in his time, but not as low as it had been in the early Bronze Age. Though he would surely have loved a pyramid, he was a victim of Egypt's own prosperity by that point, and the matter has only continued into our own day, where even minimum wage in the US buys a living standard that would have been envied by all but the wealthiest of the late Bronze Age. So as you play Pharaoh Total War, spare a thought for the soldiers and laborers who lived hard lives and managed to build the foundations of the civilization we enjoy today. If you haven't picked it up yet, I definitely recommend Pharaoh if you are a Total War fan, as it is as good as any of the titles now that it's full, and it's in its final form, and for all that I've been nitpicking in my videos up until now, it really does do justice to an important but neglected historical era to the extent that any popular video game really can. Make sure you're subscribed to learn more about ancient Mesopotamia. Comment down below to let me know if I missed anything significant on our tour. And until next time, thank you for watching.